The sound of heels echoed louder than usual in the quiet house. David was hunched over his laptop at the dining table, buried in the week's workload. The ticking of the clock on the wall kept him company until that sharp sound interrupted the stillness. He looked up, distracted at first, then froze as his gaze settled on his wife, Lindsay, standing near the front door. She was wearing a red dress, tight and revealing, one he hadn't seen in years. It clung to her in all the ways that screamed, "Look at me." Her lips painted to match the dress curled into a smirk. She swayed a little, twirling to check her reflection in the hallway mirror, her hands smoothing over her hips. David watched her in stunned silence for a moment, the unease building like a slow storm in his chest. "Lindsay," his voice cracked slightly. "Where are you going?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she took another look in the mirror, running her fingers through her perfectly styled hair. The atmosphere was thick, and David could feel the tension crackling between them like static electricity. When she finally turned around, her eyes gleamed with something strange, something distant. She no longer looked like the woman he had spent the last 18 years of his life with. "Honey, I'm going on a date night with my new lover," she said simply, as though it were the most normal thing in the world. David set his laptop aside and stood up slowly. The weight of her words pressed on him. "What are you talking about? You're not going anywhere," he repeated, trying to wrap his mind around the idea. She hadn't mentioned any plans for the night. In fact, their routine lately had been quiet dinners at home, lazy nights on the couch. The smirk on her lips widened, dripping with arrogance. "With Chris," she said. The name rolled off her tongue with a casual ease that made David's stomach drop. "Chris, my boss." He nearly choked on the word, his heart thudding against his ribs. A cold sweat broke across his forehead as he watched her face for any sign that this was a sick joke. But there was none, just that damn smirk. "Yes, your boss." She flicked her wrist as if waving off the gravity of her confession. "We've been seeing each other for a while now, David." He felt the ground shift beneath him. The calm that usually defined him was slipping away fast. His hands balled into a fist at his sides, a storm of confusion, anger, and disbelief swirling inside him. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice trembled slightly, but he stood his ground, staring her down. "You're not serious, Lindsay. You can't be." She crossed her arms over her chest, the mocking glint in her eyes growing more prominent. "I'm very serious, David. Chris knows how to make me feel alive, something you haven't done in years. I promised him a wild night." David flinched. Her words hit harder than any punch ever could. "This is insane. You're leaving me for Chris." He spat the name out like it was poison. "The guy's a player. He doesn't care about you." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "And you do," she shot back, stepping toward him. "You haven't looked at me like this in years, David. You've become a shell of the man I married, boring, predictable. Chris makes me feel wanted." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. His wife, the woman he had devoted almost 2 decades of his life to, was standing there telling him she was going on a date with his boss. He clenched his fists harder, feeling his nails bite into his palms. "You can't do this, Lindsay," he scoffed, shaking his head. "Don't tell me what I can and can't do. I'm tired of living under your rules, of pretending this marriage isn't dead." David's anger boiled over. "You're throwing away everything we've built. 18 years, Lindsay. 18 years of marriage, of memories, of promises, for what? Some cheap thrill." Her face twisted in irritation. "It's not just a cheap thrill. Chris is a real man. He knows how to take care of me. He makes me feel alive in ways you never could. You're a boring, washed-up version of who you used to be. And I'm done pretending like I'm happy." David took a step forward, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "I don't care what you think of me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But you're not going out tonight. Not with him. Not with anyone." Lindsay raised an eyebrow, clearly amused by his threat. "Don't you dare try to control me, David," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You've never been able to before, and you won't start now. I promised Chris a wild night, and I plan on delivering." David's heart raced as he stared at her, his mind reeling from the audacity of it all. "If you walk out that door," he said, the words slipping out in a final warning, "we're done. Do you hear me, Lindsay?" She paused just for a moment, her eyes narrowing as if considering his words. But then with a dismissive wave of her hand, she brushed him off like dust on her dress. "You're pathetic," she said, her voice cold and final. David's breath hitched in his throat. He watched frozen, as Lindsay turned her back to him, grabbed her purse, and strutted toward the door. The sound of her heels echoed like a countdown to the end of their marriage. "Lindsay," he called out, his voice desperate now. "If you leave, don't expect to come back. I'm serious." But she didn't stop, didn't hesitate. The door swung open, the cool night air slipping into the room like a silent thief, and then with a soft click, the door closed behind her, sealing her departure. David stood there, rooted in place, staring at the door as if willing it to reopen, as if she might come back. But the house was empty now, eerily silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. His pulse pounded in his ears, the anger and disbelief mixing into a cold, sinking feeling in his gut. He sank back into his chair, his hands trembling as he rubbed them over his face. The reality of it all crashed down on him. She was gone, not just for the night, but gone from his life, from their marriage. The weight of her betrayal pressed on him like a vice. David stared at the empty space where she had stood moments before, his mind racing. Flashes of their years together played like a broken film reel. The dinners, the vacations, the little moments they had shared. All of it shattered in an instant. For the first time in 18 years, he was alone in a house that felt too big, too empty. He sat in the quiet for what felt like hours, his mind replaying the confrontation over and over. Her cruel laughter, her cold words, the way she had walked out like it meant nothing. As the minutes dragged on, something shifted inside him. The disbelief slowly gave way to something darker, something more determined. His jaw tightened, and his gaze hardened. She thought she could just walk out and leave him broken, as if his world would collapse without her. But she had no idea what was coming. David glanced around the house, his eyes landing on the framed photos on the walls. The happy memories that had once filled his life with meaning now felt like ghosts, reminders of a life that was gone. She wanted to throw away their marriage for a night of fun with his boss? Fine, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. David pushed himself up from the chair, his mind clear for the first time that night. There was only one thing left to do now. It was time to end things on his terms. David didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the evening's events in his head like a broken record. The sound of Lindsay's heels, the casual cruelty in her voice, her cold laugh, it all kept crashing over him. His wife, the woman he had shared almost 2 decades with, had walked out of his life for another man. And not just any man. His boss. The shock at first was like someone had ripped the ground out from under him. His life had been ripped open. But beneath the hurt, beneath the disbelief, there was something else brewing. Something darker. Revenge. As the night wore on, the pain began to harden into a clear, cold resolve. He wasn't going to be the one begging for her to come back. There would be no groveling. No desperate attempts to fix what was clearly broken beyond repair. Lindsay had made her choice, and now she was going to live with the consequences. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, David had made his decision. He got out of bed, his movements deliberate. He walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and looked at his reflection. The man staring back at him wasn't the same man who had been blindsided the night before. He was focused, determined, and ready to take control. Without a word, David dressed and headed to the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. The silence pressed down on him, but he pushed it aside. He had work to do. He sat at the dining table, grabbed his phone, and dialed his lawyer's number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "David, it's early. What's going on?" "I need you to draw up divorce papers," David said, his voice steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "David, are you sure? Divorce is a big step." "I'm sure," David replied without hesitation. "I don't want to drag this out. Just get it done as quickly as possible." "All right," his lawyer responded, now all business. "I'll get the paperwork started. You'll need to come in and sign a few things, but I'll make it quick." David hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the empty kitchen. There was no going back now. But that was the point. He wasn't going to give Lindsay a chance to backtrack, to try and sweet-talk her way back into his life. He would make sure she couldn't. Next, he logged into his bank account. They had shared a joint account for years, but he wasn't about to let her use their hard-earned money to run off with Chris. He transferred the entire balance to his personal account, leaving nothing behind. Lindsay had made it clear that she didn't need him, so she wouldn't get a single cent of his money. Once that was done, he turned his attention to the house. It had been their home for years, the place they had built together. But now it felt like a prison full of memories that no longer mattered. Without hesitation, David contacted a real estate agent and put the house on the market. He didn't care about the sentimental value anymore. It was just a building, and he wanted it gone. "Are you sure you want to sell this quickly?" the agent asked, surprised by the urgency in his voice. "Yes," David replied, his tone firm. "Price it to move. I don't care about getting top dollar. Just get it sold as soon as possible." By the end of the morning, everything was set in motion. Divorce papers were being drawn up, the bank account was cleared, and the house was listed for sale. It all felt surreal, like a whirlwind of action that left him slightly dizzy. But there was no time to second-guess any of it. Lindsay had chosen her path, and David was making sure she'd have to walk it alone. He sat back at the table, looking around the house one last time. It no longer felt like home, just a hollow shell of what used to be. There were photos on the wall, memories of vacations, holidays, birthdays, all of them tainted now by her betrayal. David stood up and walked over to the nearest frame, staring at the smiling faces inside. He and Lindsay on their anniversary trip to Italy, standing in front of the Colosseum. He remembered how happy they'd been back then, or at least how happy he thought they'd been. With a quiet sigh, he took the photo down and placed it face down on the counter. He repeated the process with the other photos, one by one, until the walls were bare. He couldn't stand to look at them anymore. Once the house was stripped of all reminders of their life together, David returned to the kitchen. He grabbed a sheet of paper and scribbled a quick note. "You made your choice, now live with it." He placed the note on the kitchen table, right next to the divorce papers that his lawyer had emailed over. It was all there, everything she needed to see how final this was. No more games, no more lies. David took one last look around, then grabbed his car keys. He wasn't sticking around for her reaction. He didn't care what she'd say or do when she saw what he had done. That part of his life was over, and he wasn't going to waste another minute on it. As he drove away from the house, a strange sense of relief washed over him. The anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface, but it was different now. It was controlled, focused. For the first time in a long time, David felt like he was in charge of his own life again. He wasn't the broken man Lindsay had walked out on the night before. He was something else now, someone stronger. The city passed by in a blur as he drove with no real destination in mind. He didn't need one. All he knew was that he couldn't go back to the house, not yet. He needed time to breathe, to think, to figure out what came next. After what felt like hours, David pulled into a parking lot by the beach. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft orange glow over the water. He got out of the car and walked to the shoreline. The cool breeze hitting his face, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was calming, a welcome distraction from the chaos of the last 24 hours. David stood there for a while, staring out at the ocean, feeling the weight of everything that had happened begin to lift, just a little. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel trapped. He didn't feel like a man stuck in a loveless marriage, suffocating under the weight of someone else's expectations. As the sun rose higher in the sky, David turned away from the water and walked back to his car. He had made his move, and now it was Lindsay's turn to deal with the consequences. He wasn't going to stick around and watch her crumble. He had his own life to rebuild, and that was the only thing that mattered now. When Lindsay stepped through the front door the next day, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, she was expecting a confrontation, maybe even an argument where she could assert her new life with Chris, her newfound freedom. She had thought David would be sitting there waiting, anger simmering just beneath the surface, but ultimately ready to beg for forgiveness. In her mind he would plead, and she would wield her power over him, finally free of the man she had grown to resent. But when she crossed the threshold, something was wrong. The house was too quiet, Not just the quiet of an empty home, but a hollow, unnatural silence. It felt cold. "David," she called, her voice cutting through the still air. No answer. She clicked her heels toward the kitchen, where she expected to find him brooding or maybe even crying. But there was no sign of him. What she did find made her stop dead in her tracks. On the kitchen table, stark and clinical, were a stack of papers, divorce papers. She blinked, the sight hitting her like a punch. The laughter that had bubbled up from her successful night with Chris vanished in an instant. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the neatly arranged papers and the short, chilling note beside them. "You made your choice, now live with it." Lindsay's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was seeing. This wasn't what she had expected. She had imagined David crumbling under the weight of her betrayal, not vanishing from her life without so much as a fight. She grabbed the papers, flipping through them with shaky hands. It was real. He had filed for divorce, and it was all here, waiting for her signature. "No, no, no, no," Lindsay muttered, her voice trembling. Panic set in. She pulled out her phone and dialed David's number, her fingers fumbling on the screen. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. She tried again, her heart pounding faster with each unanswered ring. "David, please pick up," she whispered frantically to herself. When the call went to voicemail, she left a hurried message. "David, it's me. We need to talk. Please call me back." She tried texting him, sending message after message, but each one remained unread. It was like he had disappeared. Her chest tightened as the gravity of the situation sank in. David wasn't here. He wasn't waiting for her to come back. He was gone. She rushed upstairs to the bedroom, flinging open the closet. His clothes were gone, his shoes, his belongings all gone. She ran to the bathroom, throwing open the medicine cabinet. Empty. It was as if he had erased every trace of himself from the house. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. David wasn't just mad. He was done. Lindsay stood there, staring at the empty closet, her heart racing. This wasn't supposed to happen. David was supposed to be the weak one, the one who couldn't live without her. But now it was she who had been left with nothing. She stumbled back downstairs, her mind racing, and went straight to the computer to check their bank account. When she logged in, her heart sank even further. The balance showed a big fat zero. He had drained everything. All the money they had saved together was gone, transferred to an account she had no access to. "No," she whispered, a knot forming in her throat. He wouldn't. But he had. David had taken everything, the money, the house, the life they had built together. It was all slipping through her fingers. She felt dizzy, her vision blurring, as the full weight of her actions crashed down on her. She had thrown it all away. And for what? For a fling with her husband's boss. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her out of her day. It was Chris. For a brief moment, a wave of relief washed over her. "Chris will fix this," she thought. "But, help me through this." She quickly answered the call, trying to sound composed despite the panic in her voice. "Chris," she breathed, "I need to talk to you." "David, he's gone. He left me with nothing." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when Chris finally spoke, his voice was distant. "Yeah, Lindsay. I've been meaning to talk to you about that." Her heart skipped a beat. Something in his tone made her stomach churn. "What do you mean?" Chris sighed. "Look, Lindsay, what we had, it was fun, okay? It was exciting. But I'm not looking for anything serious." Lindsay froze. "What are you talking about? We were together last night." "Yeah, and it was great," he replied, his voice oozing with nonchalance. "But I'm not looking for a commitment. You leaving David, that's not my problem." Lindsay's grip tightened around her phone. "You're just going to walk away after everything?" Chris's tone grew cold. "Lindsay, you made your choice. You left your husband, that's on you, not me." The words hit her like a slap in the face. It was the same thing David had said in his note. "Chris, please," she began, her voice cracking, but he cut her off. "Look, I got a lot going on right now. I don't need this drama," he said dismissively. "I think it's best if we don't see each other anymore." And just like that, the line went dead. Lindsay stood there in shock, the phone still pressed to her ear long after the call had ended. Chris had dumped her. The man she had thrown her entire life away for had walked out on her, as casually as if he were canceling a dinner reservation. She threw the phone onto the kitchen counter, her hands trembling. This couldn't be happening. Everything was falling apart. She had lost David. She had lost Chris, and now she had nothing left. The days followed were a blur. Lindsay tried to pick up the pieces, but everything had crumbled around her. She moved out of the house, staying in a dingy motel while she figured out what to do next. The life of luxury she had imagined with Chris had dissolved into a nightmare. Every time she tried to call David, it went straight to voicemail. Every text she sent remained unanswered. It was as if he had disappeared off the face of the earth, leaving her to face the mess she had created. She thought about going back to work, but the idea of facing Chris in the office was unbearable. Her once thrilling affair had turned into a source of shame. People at work would whisper behind her back. She was sure of it. Besides, with her marriage over, she wasn't sure she'd even have a job for much longer. Chris could easily make sure she was let go. He had that kind of power. As the days turned into weeks, Lindsay's hope dwindled. The nights she had once spent in fine restaurants and luxury hotels were now spent in a cramped motel room. The smell of stale cigarettes and cheap detergent clung to her clothes. Chris's promises of a future together had vanished, and so had he. Alone with nothing but her regret, Lindsay was left to confront the choices she had made. Choices that had cost her everything. While Lindsay's life was unraveling, David's was finally coming together. After disappearing from the chaos of his old life, he found himself at a crossroads. The weeks following his departure had been filled with uncertainty, but also a strange sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. The weight of his marriage, of constantly trying to please someone who no longer cared, had lifted. It was time for him to take control of his own future. David's first move was to sever all remaining ties with the past. He found a small apartment in a different part of town, far away from the house that held too many painful memories. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. There were no pictures of Lindsay, no remnants of their life together. It was a blank canvas, a place where he could rebuild himself without the shadow of his failed marriage looming over him. The first few days in the new apartment were strange, quiet, but for David it was a different kind of silence than the one he'd lived in for years. This was peaceful, not oppressive. It was the sound of a life that was no longer dictated by someone else's desires. He filled his time with simple tasks: cleaning, unpacking, getting used to his new space. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't have to answer to anyone but himself. Once the immediate rush of moving faded, David turned his attention back to his career. Chris had always held him back, keeping him under his thumb, constantly making David feel like he wasn't good enough. That dynamic had taken a toll on his self-esteem, but now with Chris and Lindsay out of his life, David saw an opportunity. He didn't just want to move on from his personal life. He wanted to level up in every way possible. One afternoon, sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, he pulled out his laptop and started searching for new jobs. He didn't just want any job, though. He wanted something better, something that would challenge him and allow him to finally reach his full potential. He sent out applications, tailoring each one to highlight his strengths, his years of experience, and his determination to succeed. Within a week, the emails started coming in, interest from companies that had heard about his work and were eager to bring him on board. One in particular stood out: a tech startup on the rise, known for its innovation and forward-thinking approach. David was intrigued. He scheduled an interview, and within days, he was sitting across from the company's CEO, discussing his ideas, his vision, and how he could contribute to their team. The interview was a success. They offered him the job on the spot, and it came with a promotion that David hadn't even dared to dream of. It was more responsibility, more money, and more freedom than he had ever experienced before. As he left the office that day, a feeling of exhilaration rushed through him. He had finally broken free from Chris's control, from the job that had kept him stagnant for years. This was a fresh start. With his new position came financial freedom. David no longer had to worry about money, about scraping by or relying on joint accounts. He bought a new car, sleek and efficient, and for the first time in his life, he didn't feel guilty about treating himself. He had earned this. As the months passed, David threw himself into his work. He rose through the ranks at the company faster than he could have imagined, gaining the respect of his colleagues and the admiration of his bosses. His new role wasn't just about the title or the paycheck. It was about proving to himself that he could succeed on his own terms. He wasn't the man Lindsay had dismissed, the one Chris had belittled. He was more than that. But it wasn't just his career that thrived. David took the time to focus on his health, both physical and mental. He joined a gym, something he hadn't done in years. His routine became structured and disciplined. Early mornings were spent running, feeling the rhythm of his feet hitting the pavement as the sun rose. Afternoons were for strength training, pushing his body to its limits, feeling stronger and more confident with every session. It wasn't about getting back at Lindsay anymore. It was about reclaiming himself. And then there were the small, quiet victories. The mornings he woke up in his new home feeling truly rested. The weekends spent hiking in the nearby mountains, surrounded by nature, his mind clear and free. The friendships he built with his new coworkers, who respected him for who he was and what he could do, not for his connections or his personal life. Little by little, David was building a life that was entirely his own. One day, as he sat on his balcony overlooking the city, a glass of wine in hand, David realized something that surprised him. He was happy, truly happy. It wasn't the kind of happiness that came from material things or even career success. Though those things helped, it was a deeper sense of peace, of knowing that he had survived one of the hardest experiences of his life and come out stronger on the other side. He thought about Lindsay sometimes, but the pain had dulled. It was no longer a sharp, cutting thing that consumed his every thought. Now it was more of a distant memory, something that had happened but didn't define him. He had learned from it, grown from it, and moved on. Lindsay had tried to tear him down, but in the end, she had only freed him from a life that had been holding him back. David smiled to himself, thinking about how different things were now. He had everything he needed, everything he had always deserved but had been too afraid to claim. He didn't know where Lindsay was or what she was doing, and truthfully, he didn't care. Her choices had led her down her own path, and he wasn't responsible for that. He was responsible for himself, for his own happiness, and that was more than enough. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the city, David raised his glass to the sky, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. His life had risen from the ashes of his failed marriage, and now he was stronger than ever before. He had built something new, something better, and it was only just the beginning. And so, while Lindsay's world crumbled under the weight of her choices, David's was just beginning to bloom. He was in control now, and the future was his to shape. Years had passed, but for Lindsay, the regret had only deepened with each passing day. The once exciting thrill of her affair with Chris was a distant, bitter memory, replaced by the stark reality of all she had lost. She had sacrificed her marriage, her stability, and her future for a fleeting fantasy. Now she was left alone to face the consequences of her choices. In the beginning, she had tried to convince herself that things would get better after Chris left. She told herself she could start over. She tried dating again, seeking the same excitement she had once felt. But it was never the same. The men she met were nothing like David, nothing like the steady, caring husband she had taken for granted. They were either too self-absorbed or too unreliable, and no matter how many dates she went on, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling of emptiness inside her. There were nights when Lindsay lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling of her small apartment, wondering how things had gone so wrong. She thought back to the life she had once shared with David, the home they had built together, the memories of their years of marriage, the small, quiet moments of comfort she hadn't appreciated. All of it was gone now, and she had no one to blame but herself. One cold evening, as Lindsay sat on her couch scrolling through old photos on her phone, she stumbled upon a picture of her and David from their 10th anniversary. They were standing on a beach, the sun setting behind them, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. Lindsay's thumb hovered over the image, her chest tightening as she remembered that day. She remembered the way David had surprised her with the trip, how happy she had been in that moment, and how much he had loved her back then. Her eyes stung with tears, and before she knew it, they were rolling down her cheeks. "God, what did I do?" she whispered to herself, burying her face in her hands. The weight of her regret was unbearable. For years, Lindsay had convinced herself that David had been the problem, that he hadn't been enough for her. But the truth was, she had been the one who wasn't enough. She had let herself be swayed by Chris's empty promises and the excitement of something new. And in doing so, she had destroyed the one thing that had ever truly mattered. Weeks passed, and Lindsay's thoughts became more and more consumed by David. She couldn't stop thinking about him, where he was, what he was doing, whether he had found happiness after everything she had put him through. The idea of him moving on without her, living a better life while she was stuck in the mess she had created, haunted her. She began to wonder if there was still a chance, if maybe, just maybe, she could ask for his forgiveness. The idea seemed absurd at first. After all, she had been the one to betray him. She had laughed in his face when he had begged her not to leave that night. But the regret was overwhelming, and Lindsay couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to at least try. One afternoon, she sat down at her kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper in front of her. She picked up a pen and hesitated, her hand trembling as she tried to figure out what to say. How could she possibly put all her remorse into words? How could she ask for forgiveness when she knew she didn't deserve it? Finally, after what felt like hours, Lindsay began to write. David, I don't know where to begin, or if you'll even read this, but I have to try. I've spent years thinking about everything that happened, and every day, I regret the choices I made. I know I hurt you in ways that can never be undone, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. Leaving you was the worst mistake of my life. I was selfish and blind to everything you did for me, and I didn't realize what I had until it was too late. I thought I needed something more, something different, but now I know that I was wrong. You were always enough, and I was too foolish to see it. I'm not asking for a second chance. I know that ship has sailed. I just want you to know how deeply I regret everything. You deserved better than what I gave you, and I'm sorry. I couldn't be the wife you needed. I hope you found happiness, David, truly. I'll always remember the good times we had, and I'll always regret what I threw away. With all my remorse, Lindsay. Her hand shook as she finished the letter. She read it over several times, tears blurring her vision as she folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope. She didn't know if David would even bother to read it, but she had to send it. It was the only thing she could do, the only way she could try to make amends, however small. Lindsay spent the next few days anxiously checking her mailbox, hoping for some kind of response. She knew it was a long shot, but part of her couldn't help but hold on to a sliver of hope that David might reach out. Maybe he would understand how much she regretted everything, or at least give her the chance to apologize in person. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that no response was coming. The mailbox remained empty, and David remained silent. Lindsay felt the crushing weight of his absence. He had moved on, built a new life without her, and there was no room for the woman who had betrayed him. One afternoon, as Lindsay sat by her window watching the rain fall outside, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an old mutual friend, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The subject line made her heart race. David. With trembling hands, Lindsay opened the email. It was brief, just a few lines informing her that David had remarried. He had met someone new, a woman who loved and appreciated him the way Lindsay never had. They had recently bought a home together, and were expecting their first child. The news hit Lindsay like a punch to the gut. She felt the air leave her lungs as she stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of her eyes. David had moved on, and not just moved on. He had built a new life, a better life without her. He was happy, had found love again, the kind of love she had taken for granted. For the first time, the finality of her choices truly sank in. There was no going back, no reconciliation, no forgiveness. David had moved forward, and she was left behind, stuck in the wreckage of her own making. As Lindsay sat in the quiet of her apartment, the rain tapping against the window, she realized that this was her life now. A life filled with regret, with the knowledge that she had destroyed the one good thing she had ever had. And there was no one to blame but herself. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it alone. Lindsay had never expected her life to turn out like this. Isolated, hollow, and filled with the unrelenting weight of her mistakes. She had imagined a future with Chris, the man she had risked everything for, filled with excitement and adventure. But that future never materialized. As the months passed, Her fantasies of a better life with him dissolved into the stark reality that she was alone, and the wreckage of her life was all she had left. One particularly grim evening, Lindsay sat in her dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at her reflection in the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, but inside her world felt darker than ever. The air was thick with silence, the kind that presses down on you and refuses to let you breathe. She hadn't heard from Chris in over a year, not since he had unceremoniously discarded her after their affair had lost its spark. No apology, no explanation. He had simply moved on, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life she had torn apart. As Lindsay sat there, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, hoping for some news, a job offer, or maybe an old friend reaching out. But it was just another bill notification. Her finances were in complete disarray, thanks to the combination of bad decisions, legal fees from the divorce, and the sudden evaporation of her support system. The friends she thought she had, those who had encouraged her affair, whispered in her ear about how David wasn't enough, had vanished the moment her life began to crumble. She was toxic to be around now, and people distanced themselves. She sighed heavily, running her hands through her hair as she recalled the times when everything had seemed so easy. David had always taken care of things. He had handled the finances, managed the house, and made sure their life was stable. Lindsay had never truly appreciated it until it was gone. Now she had an in for herself in a world that didn't care whether she sank or swam. Her thoughts drifted to David, as they often did. It had become a sort of cruel habit, checking up on him, seeing how his life had blossomed after she left. Lindsay had found his new social media accounts months ago, even though he had blocked her from everything else. His life was nothing like hers, nothing like the life they had once shared. David's face was radiant in his photos, standing beside his new wife Hannah. Lindsay had learned her name through one of his old friends, who had mentioned it in passing when she ran into him at a grocery store. Hannah looked warm and kind, the kind of woman who would never take David for granted. The most recent post was from a vacation they had taken to Italy, a dream destination that Lindsay had always talked about, but never actually made the effort to plan. There they were, smiling in front of the Colosseum, hand in hand, looking more in love than Lindsay and David had ever been in their last years together. The image seared itself into her mind. She closed her laptop, unable to look at the photos any longer. But the damage was done. It had been years since the divorce, yet the regret was as fresh as ever. Every choice she had made since that fateful night when she walked out the door felt like a step deeper into a pit she would never climb out of. Lindsay's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a bill notification. It was an email from a recruiter, a rejection for the latest job she had applied to. Her career, once promising, had flatlined after the affair became public knowledge. Word had spread quickly in their social circles, and soon after, it reached her professional life. Opportunities that once seemed within reach evaporated as she became that woman, the one who had left her husband for his boss. No one wanted the drama that came with hiring her, and as time went on, her resume became a patchwork of temporary jobs and layoffs. She had been working as a receptionist at a real estate agency, far below her previous position, just to make ends meet. The pay barely covered her rent and utilities, and she had long since dipped into her savings to cover other expenses. Now, with no savings left and fewer prospects, the future looked bleak. Lindsay knew she had to do something. She thought about reaching out to David again. Maybe if she explained herself better, maybe if she could show him how much she had changed, he would understand. There had to be a way to fix things. He had been kind once, compassionate. Surely he could find it in his heart to forgive her, or at least hear her out. With a sudden burst of resolve, she opened her laptop again, searching for his contact information. It didn't take long to find his business website. He had recently opened his own consulting firm, another testament to how well his life had turned out. She hesitated for a moment before clicking on the contact page. There was his professional email. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. What could she possibly say to him that would make up for what she had done? She had already sent him that letter, pouring out her remorse, but he had never responded. Why would this time be any different? Before she could stop herself, Lindsay began typing, "David, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I don't blame you, but I need you to understand how much I regret everything that happened. I was selfish and I destroyed something beautiful. I've spent every day wishing I could undo the past, but I know I can't. I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know that I'm sorry truly. I can see how much you've built since I left, and I'm happy for you. Even if it hurts to know I'm not a part of it. I hope one day you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Lindsay stared at the message for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest. What was she doing? She wasn't this person, the desperate, remorseful ex-wife trying to claw back something she had thrown away. But then again, what else did she have left? Before she could think too much about it, Lindsay hit send. The email flew into the void, and with it, the last shred of hope she had been holding on to. The next few days were a blur. Lindsay checked her inbox obsessively, waiting for any sign of a reply from David. But as the days stretched into a week, then too the realization set in. He wasn't going to respond. He was done with her, and he had every right to be. One afternoon, as Lindsay walked down the street from her apartment to the local grocery store, she saw a familiar face across the parking lot. David's. He was with Anna, laughing as they carried bags to their car. They hadn't noticed her yet, and for a brief moment, Lindsay froze, torn between wanting to run and hide or walk up to them. But before she could decide, David glanced in her direction, his eyes locked with hers for a split second, and then without a word, he turned away, continuing his conversation with Anna as if Lindsay had never existed. That moment, more than any rejection or financial struggle, broke her. David had moved on. He was happy, and she was nothing but a shadow of a life he had left behind. As Lindsay watched them drive away, she realized the reckoning was complete. There would be no forgiveness, no reconciliation, and no escape from the consequences of her choices. The regret she carried was hers to bear, and it would follow her for the rest of her life.